Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Itential webinar. My name is Rich Martin, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential. And today we're going to spend some time talking about and looking at how to do some automated provisioning of cloud networking infrastructure. By way of some points in our demo in our presentation today, we'll talk and take a look at the AWS API methods for networking. This would hold true also for MS Azure, Google Compute Platform, any cloud that can that has any cloud platform today usually has robust API methods. It's important to understand those documentations, but once they're onboarded into the system, we have access to all the API calls that are available to us. So we'll be looking at that for AWS specifically. But again, the same methodology holds true for all of the other cloud platforms. We'll take a look at some of the foundational cloud network elements. Of course, there's a lot just in AWS. There's a lot of foundational cloud network elements, starting with VPCs. We're going to use VPCs and subnets today because they are prerequisites for creating a transit, not for creating a transit gateway, but attaching to a transit gateway. And so that's the other thing we'll be doing is we'll be, creating a transit gateway in an automation. You might not actually be doing this, creating new transit gateways. I mean, maybe if you're spinning up a lab or something like that, you may not be spinning up a transit gateway in an automation. Typically, they kind of already exist. But again, you can do that because these API methods are available. So we'll do that just to show how you can do something like that with a transit gateway. Then we'll take a look at how to query these different AWS assets to understand, their state, and in particular, we'll take a look at the transit gateway because that one takes a little bit of time to create. And one of the things you'll notice, especially if you're coming from a networking background, as you're building and managing things in AWS around networking, it could be around anything AWS offers. Some services and features take a little longer, right? So the key here is how do we, overcome that? There's a couple of ways to do it within an automation. So one of those is querying the state to determine what's, if it's okay to continue. We'll take a look at attaching VPCs to a transit gateway, and then we'll take a look at continuing on how to create VPC routes. This would also be similar to a lot of other VPC related network functions like security groups and network ACLs as well. So with that, let's continue to the next slide. Just a real general overview of the demo. When we're going to break this down because I like to start simple, but we're going to get some data from a form. Could as a simple source of truth here. Could be another system. Could be Netbox or any other database of some sort. But in this case, we're going to get some data from there, and we're going to create a couple of VPCs in an automation and a transit gateway and attach them all together. So that's really what we're doing here. So we need initially to kind of seed the VPCs with the required data that it needs. In this case, it's subnets. So that's where our data comes from, is from a form that's going to feed us the subnets. That'll be used later in the workflow. The first thing we'll do, though, is we'll create the transit gateway, because that's kind of a fundamental thing. If we're going to attach VPCs to a transit gateway, you got to have that. We also need VPCs themselves. And along with the VPCs, we also have to create subnets. And then once we have that, then we can go through the process of attaching them to the transit gateway. So with that, let me share my screen, and we will continue on with the demo. Okay. So we start first off in the Itential automation platform. This is the automation studio. So this is where we would build automations from scratch. I've started here very, very, very simple. On the right-hand side, you'll see that once we integrate different systems, whether they're networking systems or their IT systems or anything. We use API integration. You'll see a lot of different types of integrations we have here. As soon as those systems are integrated into the platform, they become available here, and their API calls become available here as drag and drop items onto this canvas. So I've already started this just just for sake of time. But you'll notice here I have this green box, which is an API method that comes from the AWS EC2 adapter. And these are all the methods that are available to us. So on the Itential platform, like I said, we have different ways of doing integrations. We have adapters, which are part of a pre-built library. So we have a pre-built library for our customers to use, so they can take advantage of work that's already been done. A lot of the demos that we cover here come from pre-builts. We use pre-builts to do that, and a pre-built can be an automation itself. It could be an adapter, so that's a type of integration into a system. Could be a transformation. We'll talk a little bit about data transformations in a moment. All of those are available, and in this case, this is the AWS EC2 adapter that we've got onboarded. So now, once the adapter is onboarded, and we've given it the proper credentials in order to access our AWS account information, then we can start to use any of these many API methods. And this is, again, a key thing is to know two things: how the particular cloud services work from the the console state. So if I go over here, I can go to my VPCs, which I'm already here, and I can see a list of my VPCs. If I were to create a VPC here, it's going to ask me for some information. Some of it is absolutely required, like for instance, the CIDR, so the subnet, the information that we need. Then I could create the VPC. Just understanding the manual process through their dashboard of how to do that gives you some fundamental understanding of how to do it in an automation. So in this case, I could do something like, as I understand the AWS API calls, I know something like create VPC comes available. Now I can see, if I search, I can filter out all of the available create VPC. So there's several, right? Create VPC, endpoints, just because there's all kinds of features and services and functions available under AWS for VPCs. But these are the underlying calls. But in this case, I'm using just the general function to create a new VPC. So if I click here, it would create this box that now becomes on my drag and drop element on my desktop in Studio. If I double click this, it's going to ask me some data that is coming from the API call, right? So we learn this through the API call that is published in AWS. And if you look here, one of the necessary blocks is a CIDR block. That's what I just showed you under the dashboard when I clicked on Create VPC. So there's a very specific correlation between the two. That's why I say, if you understand how to build these things manually, when you go over to to our automation platform and start to build the automations, it'll make a whole lot of sense. I mean, the other side of that too is that AWS has a ton of documentation around their API calls and examples. And so looking at those as well becomes very helpful. In addition to that, we also have tooltips that help, and this comes from the API integration and the adapter to help you understand some of the required elements here. In this case, it's asking for a CIDR block. Now, this is a variable that can come from another task. So as this workflow builds out, I'm going to show you how we can share variables from different tasks, because this is a really big part of creating and automating anything in AWS. There's always this idea of you have to build upon something. So for instance, if I create a VPC, that gives me a unique VPC ID, and once that's instantiated in AWS, then I could potentially add a route to it, right? But then I would need to know which route table is assigned to that VPC. So I would need the VPC information to identify the route table that I can make changes to, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand that you probably will need variables from preceding API calls into AWS, and storing those variables somewhere so that they can be used later. And we do that through queries and transformations, and I'll show you that as we build this workflow along. So here but for testing purposes, we can actually just manually assign things. Again, great for testing, but in a real workflow, we're going to grab that data from somewhere else. It could be a source of truth, or it could be from previous API calls. So really, this is all I need. Just like if I was in the dashboard in AWS, in the AWS console, I could just create a VPC, paste that in, hit create, and it would create it. In this case, we'll do that through an automation just to show you how it is. Now, I also have something called query here. Query, like I just said, is going to help us extract some information from the API call previous to it. And we reference that through some of the necessary variables that need to be filled out here. So query, again, comes from here, from the right side. So I can go query, and we have a task here called query that gives us this. When I double click it, it tells me, okay, here are the things we need to set for this query to occur. And what a query is going to do is going to extract something, some important bit of information from the data that came before it. In this case, it's a JSON query. So the data that comes before it's going to come from the previous API call. So this is the AWS API call to create a VPC. The data that gets output from that is saved as a variable, as a JSON object called result. And then this query will allow me to identify, using a JSON query string here, specifically the information that I want. And what I want is the VPC ID, because that becomes the element that I need. So if I create a new VPC, in order to modify a route table or create a subnet, as in this case, I need to know the VPC ID so I can use that as the identifier to query, to do another API call that does a query or a description for that particular VPC. So that's what this does here. So let's save it and run it. And when I view the job, it's going to show the running job. Now, this will complete very quickly because it's a very quick API call, but it allows us to go in and take a look at the data that actually gets passed. So when we're creating a workflow, we're just building, the steps, but when we run it, we can actually see the API calls and the data that gets transferred across. So if I look at this first step, which was the API call to create a VPC, you'll notice this is what we statically pass to it. So I want my VPC to have this unique subnet associated to it. And so that's the incoming variable. So that's the data we pass to the API call. The outgoing, so when the API call was completed, this is the response we got. And of course, it is a lot of data. What we want to do is we want to filter through that data and really just pull out the necessary information that we need for subsequent API calls in our automation. So in this case, really what we're looking for is this information right here, this VPC ID, because this is the unique VPC that AWS has now created for this. And so in order to extract that data out and kind of identify it and make it useful for subsequent calls, that's where that query came in. So if I click on query, we can take a look at the variables. Again, it has a set of incoming variables. Those incoming variables came from what we filled out when I double clicked it. So the first thing was, what is the query string? So this is that JSON query that I created. And then what is the object we're going to run the query on? In this case, this is the data that came from that first API call. And so the query string is going to look for response right here. So this object called response, it's going to go down the tree, create VPC response, which is this next level on the tree, VPC, this next level on the tree, and then VPC ID. So that gets us the data we need right from the source as well. And so it's going to output that as an individual standalone variable that can be used now later on in subsequent automations. So if I go to AWS and I look at my VPCs here, you should be able to see this is the one that was created with 192.168.99.0/24. So that was the subnet. I haven't set a name on it, so we can kind of identify it from the stuff that's actually in use. And then I can go here and delete that because it's good to clean up after yourself. So let me delete that VPC. Now let's go back to where we were. So we go from taking a single API call to do something very straightforward, creating the VPC. We ran that, we saw the data and how to query data out. Now we step into adding another API call from AWS, and this is create subnet for the VPC. Again, this comes from the right side here, AWS EC2. From there, and there's a create subnet call. that allows us to create a subnet in an existing VPC. So when you add that and you double click it, what we'll see is that it's going to also require some information from us in order for this particular API method to proceed. Let me double click it again. I'm slowing up here. Okay, let's see. Hopefully I'm still streaming here. Oh, there we go. Just came back. Okay. So that create subnet requires some data here. It requires the CIDR block for the subnet. So this is going to be a block within the block, a smaller block within the larger block that we identified for the VPC. So just for test purposes, 192.168.99.0/28. Recall that when I created it, we ran it and created it, I did a /24. So this would be a smaller block within that. So we're kind of carving out a subnet there. But the key here is this VPC ID. So again, where does that data come from? That data here comes from the very first call that we did that returned that VPC ID. And now I'm going to use that. I'm going to reference it because this is the query call. Remember, the query extracted that VPC ID from all of that data that we got in that JSON object that was returned from the API call. We identified that data by its references, its reference variable in the JSON query, and then it's extracted it. It's now made it available as its output. So this is that reference to that. So that now you can kind of see what we're doing here. So now we've created the VPC, we've extracted that variable becomes part of what we use here to create the subnet for the VPC. And again, we're doing this simply because this is a transit gateway requires this. So when we attach to a transit gateway, we want to make sure that we have the subnet available for this VPC. Now we're doing another query here. And in this query here, we're getting the subnet response. So similarly, we leverage the VPC ID for a variable to fill out a variable here. When this runs and returns, it's going to come back with a unique subnet ID because we're creating something net new. And that unique subnet ID is going to be embedded in a JSON object that's returned from this API call in AWS. So again, I'm going to do another query here to extract it, and that's what it's doing. So I'm going to make this query is going to use the output of the create subnet VPC. So that's the API call in AWS. And now I'm looking specifically for within that JSON object the subnet ID, very similar to the VPC ID that we just did a minute ago. So once that's done, now that localizes that variable so it can be used in another part of our automation. So I won't run that because we're going to run the whole thing here in a minute. But one of the things I do want to point out is how we extract that data, how we pull these API calls as drag and drop tasks on, extract the data, and use them one for another, because this is going to be a recurring theme, especially with AWS. Create a VPC, great. Need to create a subnet in that VPC. Okay, I need data from the VPC in order to do that. So next, let's move to creating a transit gateway. So this is a little bit different. We're adding a little bit more flavor to this. And by the way, each one of these, I'm building these steps out because they're actually going to be part of a bigger overall workflow at the end that will run end to end. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating these workflows as smaller workflows so that they can be reusable. We call these child workflows. You can think of them as subroutines, if you will. And so if I do something like create transit gateway and make it kind of a standalone workflow, then other people, myself or other people on the team building automations, can also leverage that same workflow to do something foundational, like create a transit gateway. Create a VPC and a subnet will be one that we use, as well as attaching a VPC to a transit gateway. So this will create a new transit gateway. Now, a transit gateway takes a little longer to run and to execute and really to become available. So imagine if we need to build something in AWS and we're creating something net new, and like in this case, a transit gateway, and I can't do anything to the transit gateway until its state hits available, right? So its state could be pending, and until it becomes available, I really can't continue my automation. It's kind of held up because if I try to execute something that relies on that transit gateway to be up and available, even if I have the ID, it's going to AWS is going to come back and say, yeah, I can't do that. Sorry, and it's going to fail. So what we want to do here is create the transit gateway, and this typically takes something like 80 seconds. And again, this is might not be something you do all the time, but it's good to understand these things because the logic behind this holds true for so many of what you may do in a cloud platform. So we actually have an API call to create the transit gateway. In this case, there's really nothing to fill out. We're just doing it net new. So we're just going to leave it as default. Um, Then I do something here where I use a data transformation. We call this a JSON schema transformation, or JST. We'll take a look at that. That's another way of extracting data, kind of like query, but this allows you a lot more control and a lot more information and a lot more sources. And not only that, it allows you to manipulate data as well. I'll show you that in a moment. But that data there in the transformation now becomes available for subsequent API calls. So again, we're creating this, but once we create it, the state goes pending. So we actually have to wait until the state of that newly created transit gateway becomes available. Once it becomes available, then we can continue on with our automation, and that's where these other steps come in. So AWS also allows you to describe different network services and all kinds of services, basically, to tell you about their state. You can use this to understand, like from a VPC, what is its primary route table? What is its network ACL table? It will describe all of those things about whatever the API call is focused on. In this case, describes transit gateway is going to return quite a bit of information. But the important information that we're looking for is the state, because the state has to be available before we continue. So we're executing an API call that's going to describe the brand new transit gateway we just created. So where does that variable come from? It comes from a reference task. So that task is called create transit gateway, and that variable, and that's this task here. This is this JSON, this data transformation, and we'll peek at it in a minute. But we need that in order to describe the transit gateway. And notice that this is a type array. Okay, that's different from just a string. An array is multiple items. In this case, it could be multiple strings, kind of in a list, if you will, in a particular format. And so we have to meet the format because these formats are required in order to by AWS in order to meet their requirements for the data they need to execute the method. So this can actually describe multiple gateways. That's why it's an array here. So we could actually have multiple transit gateway IDs in here, and it would return in a single API method all the details for all of those. In this case, we only want one, but we have to format it as an array, and that's what that data transformation does. Once that's done, it outputs information that we need to evaluate now. So just like in a query where we can extract certain amount of data from a JSON object that's output from an API call, that's exactly what we're doing here. The evaluation is where's the data source? In this case, it's describe the transit gateway. So the result, or the JSON object that is the result of that API call that gets executed, allows us now to do a query on that data. And you'll notice here, I've already formatted the query based off of the JSON data that it returns. What am I looking for? I'm looking for the state. So I have to query through that tree using these identifiers to get to the state. And then I'm comparing that state to available. And if that evaluation is true, then it will end. Otherwise, it will give me a failure here and take this route, in which I have a delay of 10 seconds. So now I can kind of pull AWS until that state comes available and then once it's done, it will proceed through. So this allows us now the ability to wait until something's done, because again, if we go too fast and the state doesn't get us to available, if it's pending or in some other state, then our automation will fail. So again, this is a very useful technique and method for all the cloud platforms, because this is the way they work. You make an API call to create something. In some cases, it may be done very, very quickly, but it's not guaranteed so. So best practice is to do something like this and to poll and poll in a meaningful way. I'm waiting 10 seconds here. I know this typically takes, in this particular region, about 80 seconds. I could increase it to 20 or 30 or 40 seconds. But either way, this is another method and technique to do that. Now, let's see. Mentioned that. Let me see if I find my information here. Okay. This is not the right JSON transformation. I'll show that one. I'll show you that one in a minute. Okay, we're moving from creating the transit gateway. Now, another piece of our automation that we'll cover and we'll use is I'm creating another child workflow to do the VPC attachment. So in this case is we've created a VPC, we've created the subnet under that VPC, which is a subnet of the overall VPC that we've created. So if I create a /24, then I'm using a subsection of that, a /28. So I've got two subnet I've got a subnet and a VPC created. Now I need the transit gateway as well, because that's where we're going to attach this to. And by attaching VPCs to transit gateways, now you're allowing routing to occur. You're propagating routes between those systems. And so we need those three pieces of information, right? And so as you can see, as we've kind of been developing these different child workflows, that's where that information is coming from. So that data is going to be passed into here from subsequent workflows and manipulated with this transformation. I did mention transformations. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But the AWS API call here is create transit gateway VPC attachment. So if I double click it here, you'll see it requires three pieces of information. It requires the transit gateway ID. Okay, so that comes from when we create the transit gateway, we have to have that variable, right? And then of course the state of the transit gateway has to be available. Otherwise, if this executes, even with all the right data, it will still fail. So it has to be available. That's why we had that loop we just looked at. We have the VPC ID that's going to come from the workflow that creates the VPC. That same workflow is also going to use that VPC ID to create the subnet associated with that. That's correct and appropriate for this particular method here, which is to attach it all together. So we have to have those three pieces of information. Again, this is also an array. So the reason being is that if you look at if you go into AWS Transit Gateway console, and if you were to create a transit gateway, you can actually specify, attachment. Let me go to the attachments. Well, actually, I don't have a transit gateway yet, but we'll see it in a moment. If you were to create a transit gateway attachment, you would be given the opportunity, once you choose the transit gateway, it's going to give you the ability to choose multiple subnets in different regions. And so that's why this is passed as an array back to the workflow that we're working on. So let me go back here. Okay, so that's an array. So we have to meet the requirement of that, and that's what this transformation is going to do. But that's where those three pieces of information come from. So I'll hit cancel now. So in order to identify that information and format it, I'm using this transformation. And finally, we can look at what a transformation looks like. So the data is going to come into the transformation from previous calls, right? When we create previous calls to AWS where we create the transit gateway, that gives us our gateway ID. So this is an input that we're expecting. So when this transformation runs, it's going to pass data in this format. So I've created input schemas here, incoming schemas that match what I am expecting, or really what I need in order to pass it, manipulate it, and pass it out to the API call to attach the VPC to the transit gateway. So here I need the gateway ID so I can pass it. And that is this is a direct mapping. There's really no manipulation here. Remember I said that we can do queries here, which is kind of what we're doing, but we also can do data manipulation. And so in this case, the two pieces of information that are passing straight through without any data manipulation methods are transit gateway and VPC ID. But the subnet ID comes in as a string. So remember, when we create the subnet in another part of the workflow, it's going to return a subnet ID. That ID is a string. So now we have to convert that string into an array because that's what's required when we do the attachment. Again, it can attach multiple subnets. So in order to change the class that it is from string to array, I'm using a method here called new array. Basically, you drag and drop onto the canvas, and then you map one to one. So I'm going to map the first element of the array as a string from subnet ID, and then it's going to turn that basically into an array for me and then output it here in my outgoing schema. So the data in the outgoing schema is available for subsequent use by other for other API calls. So this is where the data comes from for our transit attach VPC to transit gateway. And again, we're formatting it in a way that's required for that particular API call. If it required simply a string, I could map it straight through, or not even use um, a transformation here because there really wasn't a need to do a transformation. The data existed exactly as we needed it. But many times you'll need to do transformations, especially around string manipulation and changing strings. When we look here in a moment, you'll see a little bit more string manipulation going on when we get data from our form. So that's the transformation that's going on there. That gives it the data it needs to execute that command to now do the attachment. And then I'm kind of taking a shortcut. I'm delaying 90 seconds here. We could do another loop, but in this case, I'm just going to keep it simple and delay 90 seconds. Again, not best practices, but for sake of demo, it works. This typically takes, I mean, again, it's never guaranteed, but typically takes around a minute or so to complete. So we've looked at that. Now, finally, let's take a look at the whole thing. So this is what we're actually going to be running. I wanted to show you the different pieces and parts, starting from the kind of the foundation, creating a VPC, why you need to extract data from the VPC because it's used, subsequent tasks for that, subnet, creating your VPC subnet, and that kind of thing. In this case, now we're building it all together. So when I showed you the workflow that created not just the VPC, but the VPC and subnet, that's what we're calling here. So I'm sorry, here. This is actually let me back that up because I did it a little bit out of order. That's what we're calling here. The first thing I'm doing actually is showing a form. So this is our source of truth. This is where those initial IP address subnets, those CIDR blocks that are needed for the VPC, creating the VPCs, that's where they come from. And then I'm going to extract that data from the form, and that form is within our platform. So you can create a form that literally just brings up a form that somebody can fill out as needed, can have drop boxes, free-form text fields. That data gets expressed as a JSON object. That JSON object can now be used in further, again, like everything else, can be used in further steps in our workflow. So here I'm using a data transformation to extract that data and actually manipulate that data in a bit so that it can be used later on in this VPC, create VPC. So when I showed you earlier the workflow that created the VPC and that subnet, I'm actually calling this from this child job. So this is again being able to make reusable workflows. If I just jumbled it all into one workflow, it would work, no doubt about it. But we also need to think about this is probably something we could do quite a bit. So if I create a more modular way of doing it and apply it to as a child job, then I can use that function anywhere I need to create a VPC. So what you'll see here is I'm actually reusing that same child job twice. I'm creating VPC A and VPC B. It's the same child workflow to create the VPC. I'm just passing different data to it. Here's the step to create the transit gateway. So really the first thing we're going to do in AWS here is to create a net new transit gateway. This query will extract the transit gateway ID because we need that. We don't maybe we don't need it immediately when we create subnet or the VPC and the subnet in this step, but we definitely need it here because remember, this is kind of the um, the intersection point of all of the data points we need. We need we need the transit gateway ID, we need the VPC ID, and we need the subnet ID for that VPC for this particular job. So this is attaching the the VPC to the transit gateway. So this query extracts the transit gateway ID that we create. So it makes it available here. And then I do the same thing here. When this job finishes, and now we have a net new VPC for site A and a net new subnet for site A that matches, I'm extracting those pieces of data with queries as well. So I'm creating an kind of an independent variable called that I'm going to use for the VPC ID and the subnet ID. And that comes strictly from here. So I'm extracting that out from its output, and that becomes the input for here. So now I have all three pieces of information I need. This is going to attach, and it's in the right order that it needs, because again, everything builds upon each other, especially in the cloud. And so then I have the transit gateway attach. That'll work. That'll finish out. And when that finishes, then we're going to do the whole thing all over again with a different site. So this is the second site. Here we're going to create another VPC, again, using the same child workflow as the first one. We're going to do another set of queries because now I still need to extract this information from this particular child job because it becomes useful here. Now in this final VPC, attach the VPC to the transit gateway, it's going to use the original transit gateway ID from back here. It's queried out through here. And then the data from this child job here that gets queried out here. So if we look at this, you can see how we reference this information. So this comes from the task called get transit gateway ID. So that's where that's extracted in a query. This comes from get VPC ID B. So that task is this query. And then get subnet ID B, that task is this query. I'm sorry, these queries here, because that's coming from here. So if we double click there, you'll see the reference get VPC ID B. So the output of that is what I'm referencing here in that job, and the output of get subnet ID B becomes the reference here. Now let's take a look, before we run it, let's take a look at the form. So we can create forms here. So I have what we call JSON forms, and that's because they're expressed as a JSON object when they're run and executed in an AP or a task. I can create a form here. It's kind of free form. I can drag and drop elements as needed. I've already filled this out. Really, we only need two pieces of information. What is the subnet or the CIDR block for the first site, the VPCA, and the second VPCB. I can preview this. So this gives me kind of a live view. And if I enter information here, I've already got it pre-filled. But if I enter information here and show form data, this is actually as if I were running it. This is what the data would return. That becomes useful because that's how we can now create transformation. So remember, I said that transformations allow us to take data coming in, and like queries, we can extract specific things coming out, but we also have the ability to manipulate data. We also have the ability to have multiple incoming schemas from different data sources. So the data source here is this form. So this form is going to output this data, which is the input for this schema, which matches that data that's output from the form. From that, I know to expect this VPCA subnet. So I'm going to pass that through as a variable called VPCA subnet and VPCB subnet. So that comes from the form. But remember, in order to, so that's used for building the VPC itself, which is in this case like a /24. But in order to build the subnet, I need to have a subset of that VPC subnet. So I want to create the /28. Well, how is that created? It's created by taking the subnet string that's input as a /24, and now I'm doing some data manipulation on it, on both of these. In this case, let's say our policy is to use a /28. So now I can use these methods on the right in our transformation to actually do some data manipulation and transformation to extract the IP address part of the string. So That's what I'm doing here. So this split method says split at this particular character, the /. When that returns an array, then I can take a look at the array, and I know the first element of the array, which is index 0, is going to give me the IP address. And from that, I can tack on the /28. I'm doing it through something called a template literal, which allows me to define a variable that gets input here, and then to literally type. Whoops, do that, to literally type in the freeform text that I want to add to the end of it. There could be other ways to do it. We could have done a concat and added something to it at the very end. But template literal is so handy once you understand how useful it is. You'll see how its use is all over the place. And this is one of them. So this splits our string to give me the first element, which is just the IP address without the slash and the net mask. And then the template literal feeds that in as a variable with just the IP address. And then we add in with the template, the /28, and that converts it back into a string, which now is used in the automation. And the cool thing about it is we can run this here and I can just test this. So when we're building transformations, it's very useful to test. And so when I click run there, it's going to take a set of inputs that I had used as examples here. So if I look at this, the schema, you'll see it has examples set. So these are the examples that I would enter into the JSON form that gets fed to it. It uses those as example inputs to run them through the different methods here. So in the case of the first two, VPC-A subnet should map straight to VPC-A subnet. And so the outgoing is our output here. So given the input 192.168.111.0/24, that's the output back. Same with VPC-B to this variable, VPC-B subnet. There's no change. There's no manipulation. But you'll see here VPC-A subnet 28. So that's a different variable. It's going through the different manipulations that we had defined here in order to basically pop off that /24 and pop on the /28, which is what we need in order to create the subnet for that VPC. So that's data manipulation. That's what's going on in there with the JSON form. And now we can run everything and watch it go live. All right, so if I hit run here. So when I hit run, it'll instantiate it and execute it. And we can go into what we call job manager here, or under operation manager. This is where we can watch jobs run real time and get their output. So down here is a kind of a text version of how we're stepping through everything. You'll notice that, and we'll see the visualization here. You'll notice that the very first step is this form, right? So it's got to stop and wait for me to do an input on it because I have to actually input something into here. Now, again, we're just using this as a simple and easy source of truth that shows the feature that you can do this. So if this is something that you would have to input manually, you could use this technique, this form. But if this particular task could be extracting data from a source of truth. It could be like an IPAM, could be extracting data from a ServiceNow ticket that gives us this IP information, or wherever that IP information would be stored. It doesn't have to come from a person. And as you're building more and more advanced and complex automations, you would want to be able to integrate all of those systems so that you can get that data directly from the source of truth it comes from. In this case, if I click on it, I have some actions here I can work. So this is this JSON form that we created inside of our platform. So if I wanted to change these IP addresses, I could right here, but we'll just keep it same for the sake of the demo. Click confirm, and now it'll move on. So now it has extracted that data through my JST. So remember, this is the transformation that occurred, and this transforms that into those subnets that we needed, the /24s and the /28s for both VPCs that we're going to create. Now the next step is it's running. It's running a sub workflow here. Oh, it's creating the transit gateway. Okay, so this is the task that's going to take a little while. Like I said, maybe 80 seconds. You'll notice here, this is that loop. So we're looking for the state to go to available. Right now it's in state pending. So if I go to my transit gateway here and take a look at my transit gateways in AWS, you'll see that there is one now that's been created and it's in state pending. So that's what we're doing here. We're looping through, and it's running this every 10 seconds to get an update on the state. So this is the transit gateway ID 14E1. Verify that 14E1. Yep. And again, that came from this particular call. It was output from that API call into AWS to create it, extracted into its individual um, element here, and turned into an array because that's what was needed to pass to the describe. Because again, this can describe multiple transit gateways. And then if we look at this, you can see it's on iteration 6. But if I expand this out, make it a little easier to see, you'll see what we're trying to query for is state pending. And once it hits state available, then it should move on to the end of this, which will move on to the rest of our automation. Because if we don't get to state available and we start building things, assuming that it's on top of the transit gateway, the API calls in AWS will fail. They just because it's not ready to accept those things. They're not in the right state. So now you see this went gray, so it's completed this particular step. So if I go back to the parent workflow, it should move on to this to now create the VPC. So let's go back to our transit gateway here. Let's update the status. Okay, it's become available. And let's take a look at our VPCs. All right, it has created one VPC now. So this is the VPC A, 192.168.111.0/24. So our automation has progressed. Uh-oh, let me reload that. Okay. So about to refresh there. So it's created the VPC. We saw that in AWS. It's now done the queries, and now it's actually trying to do the attach. So remember, this is 3 pieces of information we need: the transit gateway ID, we need the VPC ID, and the subnet ID. And those should have been returned. Like this should be the subnet ID returned from here. There it is from that VPC create, and this should be the VPC ID. So that was all fed into this, and now this child task is running. So again, I made these modular so they can be child jobs of larger workflows. So it's created this, and I'm doing my delay here, so this should allow it to get to the available state. I wanted to keep this pretty simple, and usually these follow up pretty quickly. But if I double click here, I can see the incoming data that we sent it. So that's the transit gateway, that's the VPC ID, and that's the subnet ID. In an array that was built by the data transformation. And so the outgoing it's pending, state pending still, at least when it first called. If we go back into here now, so that was an attachment to the VPC attachment to the transit gateway. We can see it's now available. So if I click on that, we should be able to reference all of the other information here that was passed to it. And if we look at the routes now, the route table for the the transit gateway, we should see the route up and propagating. Yep. So that's our first VPC. So we created that, provisioned that net new, did the subnet that was required for it, and now attached it. So now it should be continuing on to let's go back to the child job, to the second one. And while that's loading, we'll take a look at here. We'll refresh this. Okay, now we see the second VPC has been created. So this is 192.168.222.0/24. The other thing we can look at too is, given this subnet, we also know that it should have also created, as part of that child workflow, the subnet under it, the /28. So here we go. Here is the 192.168.222.0/28. Remember, we did a data transformation to create this string to pass to the create subnet, the AWS API call. And of course, there's also one for here for the first subnet we created. And those workflows, they're the exact same workflow. That's why I wanted to show how to make child workflows that are reusable. Again, especially when you're doing something like this in a cloud platform, you really want to make your workflows as reusable as possible, because a lot of these things you'll be doing quite a bit. Again, creating VPCs and other things like that. So the final step here is it created the VPCA, did the attach. Now it's created the VPCB. It's done the attach here. It looks like it's just completed the whole workflow. So we can go back one last time and refresh this. And now we should have, that's our gateway. We should have our attachments. Okay, we've got 2 attachments now. And then our tables. Okay, here's our table. So now the second VPC subnet is online in the transit gateway. So assuming you had EC2 instances in those VPCs, at least the foundational networking is there for them to start communicating. There is a couple of more steps that you would normally do here, but for the sake of time, I just want to show them to you. But they certainly would belong as part of an overall automation. Um, and those are like creating the VPC route. And for this, it's really no different. So to create a VPC route, you have to know what the VPC ID is. And then you have to know what the VPC route table is for that VPC. So like I showed you before, when we did a description on the transit gateway to identify the state in a loop, you can do something like this here with a VPC. So if you look at the VPC details, you would have to specify the VPC ID. When that call comes back, and that's really the only thing necessary here, when that call comes back, you're going to want to extract the route table identifier that's attached to that VPC. So when you create a VPC, AWS is going to create quite a few things under that VPC, and one of them is a route table. From that route table, you want to extract that ID, because in order to create a new route in the route table, you need the VPC ID. So in this case, we would pass that as a variable here. Route table ID comes from that query where we get the VPC ID. In addition to that, you would want to also give the transit gateway ID, which we have done in previous tasks in the workflow, which we did when we created the VPC or created the transit gateway. We got the ID from that, and then we used it when we attached VPCs to the transit gateway. So that would be available. And then finally, you need that destination CIDR block. So this would be the /24 for the other side. So you'd want to identify. So if I'm doing VPC A and I'm creating a route, I want to create a route to the subnet for VPC B. So I would make sure to specify the subnet for VPC B. And then once this is run, AWS has all the information it needs that says, okay, this is the VPC, this is the route table, this is the subnet, and then the transit gateway becomes the actual gateway that you would that it would create the route for. So then it knows for subnet B, there is a route that exists, and it tells it to use the transit gateway to get to there. So you could do the same thing with network ACLs, which is probably another step, right? So you would also want to make sure that your network ACLs reflect that they have the ability to, because you have your routing, that's all there now, but do you have, like, from a firewall and security perspective, do your network ACLs allow access into that? So that could be another step in your automation going forward. But hopefully this was helpful. You can see where you start small. You start with very basic foundational things like VPCs, how to create them. Understand that there's individual elements and identifiers that are required as you move forward to do things like creating subnets, or even creating route tables, or even updating network ACLs. And then building these workflows that can be used as reusable assets, so that you can eventually work into something that looks like this. Again, pulling data from a source of truth for our subnets, creating the VPCs automatically using child jobs that are just workflows that are using the AWS API calls in our platform, and then doing things like attaching them to the transit gateway. This could also be something like site-to-site VPNs. In fact, any of the networking elements in AWS become available for your automation needs once they're onboarded into our platform. So hopefully that gave you a good view of the fundamentals, how to get started, and how to actually build something useful as you go forward. And remember, we have incredible pre-built library with a lot of useful top use cases that are available. And so we look forward to seeing you in further webinars coming up. And again, I want to thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.